really like snakes. Recently, just the other day, I was in a bad mood, and I texted a friend of mine that I was in a bad mood, and he texted me back a picture from a tattoo parlor that has a whole wall full of snakes, and I love this wall at this tattoo parlor. He actually texted me the lizard, but he knew it would cheer me up, and I did. Oh yeah, I remember all those snakes. They're great. I love snakes. So yeah.
Welcome to the Human Science Podcast. I'm Anna, your host, and I'm so thrilled to have here today's guest. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, Anna. It's so good to be here.
Yeah, so today I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Nickrenz. Elizabeth is a psychologist, researcher, and anthropologist, and she really bridges all these domains in the field. And in this way, she also gets to talk about the autism and neurodivergency and really talks on how identity is not just about diagnoses, but how something is co-constructed in the world and in one's lived experience, really interacting with the sociological and anthropological realm of that individual. Also, Elizabeth brings a lot of big questions about belonging, meaning, and mental health. So, here today we'll be talking more about what human science really means, how someone can get into this field, and a lot about your journey. Like, how did you end up here? So, thank you for being here.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm excited about the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's going to be great. So, the big question, what is human science?
Oh, the big question.
Yeah.
So I love that you're asking this question, and I love that you are going to be asking this question to a lot of different people because I think that you're going to get a lot of different answers.
Mm-hmm.
For me, psychology as a human science has to do with a psychology that is in and of the broader world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I teach my undergrad classes, a lot of times I'll ask the students, like, what is psychology? What do you think psychology is? And sometimes I'll say, psychology is how the brain works.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'll say, psychology is how the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of those things are true and are a big part of what psychology does.
Mm-hmm.
But we are brains and minds in bodies, and we are brains and minds in bodies in broader worlds, in families, in social groups, in communities, in natural environments. You know, the audience can't see, but I'm looking out the window right now at a wall that's covered with beautiful vines. And our built environments, right? What does it mean that there's a window here that looks out on a wall, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we are always participating in worlds that we have helped to build, but that also are, you know, beyond us, that were here before us, that will hopefully be here after we're gone. And so for me, human science psychology is about how we go about being in those worlds, how we go about participating in environments, how we create the worlds around us, how they shape us in turn, how that kind of cycle works, and how to apply those observations to what have always been the core questions in psychology, you know, about memory, about attention, about cognition, about emotion, about behavior and decision making, all of these questions that psychologists have always taken up, but to do that in a way that's really integrated with the meaning that we make out of our environments and the worlds that we live in.
Mm-hmm. From what you're saying is kind of the connection between like the singular person and the universal and how those two like coexist without taking away. Yes, in psychology there's so many theories and things that guide practice and understanding of humankind, but there's a singularity within the world that cannot be lost.
Yeah, very much so. I think a lot about the relationship between uniqueness and patterns, right? How do we as psychologists attend to the unique and particular subjectivity and life story of every person,
Mm-hmm.
and also look for trends, look for patterns, look for what that person might share with others and what we might be able to learn from that and benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. That really relationship within things, like kind of like a spider web in a metaphorical way, but like how things are connected. But if you look at every single part, it makes up the whole, but and vice versa. Maybe a little bit gestalt.
Yeah.
But
I actually got to watch a spider make a spider web the other day.
no.
I was sitting on my back porch, yep, and it was just going, it was just doing its thing. And yeah, the same thing, you know, it was spinning its own unique web, but it was doing that according to a pattern of connectedness that many, many spiders share and that has evolved over a very long time. And it was doing so within the points that were given to it. I felt bad. I'd put the chairs very far apart on my porch, so the spider web was up. The spider was having to go a really long way to make this web.
Yeah.
And then, what do we do with that? I had to sort of think about, all right, am I going to just be really careful not to disturb the spider web, not to break it up, and to try to kind of leave it be? And eventually I was like, oh, I've got to move these chairs around. I don't know what to do. So, yeah, very much like a spider web in a lot of ways.
I love that, in a way of not just for what the spider web is, but how we partake part of other people's spider webs and how
Yeah.
they're part of ours at the same time, and co-constructing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings up for me that metaphor is also a big part of human science. That when we do science, a lot of times we're looking at things we can observe and see clearly, and we're looking for direct, transparent relationships between our observations and the truths that they reveal. But there's also a lot of complexity in that in between. There's a lot of things that can mean more than one thing. A spider web can mean a lot of different things to a spider, to a pair of people in a room talking. And I think being able to hold space for metaphor as symbolic representation, the multiplicity of meaning, that's part of the human science thing to me as well.
Right. So human science has all these elements, but how to you it differs from mainstream? Like, what is even mainstream in the field of psychology?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot about mainstream psychology, and I do think that psychology for a long time was really trying to prove itself as a science among sciences, which is a hard thing to do given that its object of study is so different from physical objects in the world in a lot of ways. We change when we are looked at. We change what we're doing as a result of even like being in a scientific process, right? Like I think about the times that I've participated in psychology experiments. I'm always very aware that I'm participating in a psychology experiment
Yeah.
in a way that, I don't imagine the material in a test tube to be aware of its being in a test tube in the same way. And of course, there are all kinds of complexities with the physical world as well, and the power of observation, especially when we get down to kind of really minute elements. But, for the most part, humans are very changey, very interpretive. We remember our own histories and we change our current actions based on our representation of the past, our imagination and expectation for the future. So we're very complex entities. So I think for a long time, psychology was, as a discipline, was very preoccupied with how do we nail some of this stuff down? How do we isolate individual elements? How do we, for example, set up an experimental situation where we can change one aspect and see what happens as a result of that change by controlling everything else. And I think that has led to a lot of really powerful insights and really important work. But it also leaves a lot out because so much of what we do isn't in these controlled environments. So much of how we live and love and believe and expect and remember takes place in rooms, on cameras, in front of audiences, and with things outside the window that you can't see but that I can, takes place in these complicated environments. And so, I think that when I think about what excites me about human science psychology, it's about figuring out methods for doing that work in a systematic way, for looking in a way that is, planful and intentional and to a certain extent rigorous at how we live in these worlds and how we go about living in these worlds. And I think that's something that psychology as a whole is starting to take up with a lot of curiosity, recognizing that culture matters, that structure matters, that physical environment matters, that bodies matter, that all of these things are really important. But, we don't yet have such a rich repertoire of techniques for looking at that. So for me, that's where the cutting edge of psychology is, and that's what's really exciting about what this approach has to offer.
The subjectivity of the self,
Yeah.
in a way, and how in a controlled environment, perhaps that is left out, and it's really hard to like make a rule for it all
Mhm.
in a way. But as you're navigating and talking more about human science and what is exciting to you, like how did you end up in this field? Like how it's I feel like we all
Yeah.
have our own story, our subjectivity, but
Yeah.
how it was it for you?
Yeah, so for me, it really started when I was in college. I was an undergraduate at a small liberal arts college. I went to Swarthmore,
Mm-hmm.
and I was an English major. I'd always been really good at English, and I was a psychology minor, and I wasn't very good at psychology. You know, I got B's, which was fine, but it wasn't like it wasn't my like strong subject. But it was fascinating to me. And I was really interested in, especially questions about clinical psychology. I had, like many of us do, mental health struggles of my own. I had people who were close to me who were struggling with their own mental health, and so I was really interested in what is a discipline that can help with these kinds of struggles. But also just how do we make sense of our own experience in the world?
Right.
But I wasn't connecting with the material that I was learning in a lot of my psychology classes. But I had two professors, Jean Marischek and Ken Gergen, who were teaching psychology in a way that I would now kind of connect with this human science tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And who were drawing a lot on qualitative psychology and on psychological anthropology as ways of bringing that meaning world in to psychological questions and psychological work. And I had a lot of questions of my own, as an emerging adult. I was very interested in, things like, one of the things I remember asking myself was, why are all the sort of computer programming nerds around me also so interested in British comedy? Like,
Wait,
you know,
what?
I know. Like I was noticing all of these sort of overlaps between
Mhm.
cultural phenomena. Or I actually wrote a paper about medieval imagery and how, because I was also taking a lot of medieval studies classes, and how, this was the 90s, so there was a lot of like, MUDs, multi-user dungeons. The beginning of the internet was in these spaces that were
Yeah.
organized around medieval imagery of the like that seemed to be drawn from physical images of like castles and dungeons.
Right.
So where was this coming from? Why was like a feudal organization of social life? Also something like the Society for Creative Anachronism, which a lot of the tech people I knew were
Mm-hmm.
also very involved in these kinds of imaginative communities that were structured around this kind of anachronistic view of social life.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that was a psychological question. It was a question about our inclinations. It was a question about our pursuits. It was a question about how our individual subjectivities are structured by the cultural materials around us. I'm not sure I would have had that language at the time. It was just a question of like, why? Why do people do what they do? Why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
How is this going to help me date the cute programmers I wanted to date? These very pressing
Yeah.
questions about human motivation, biology.
Yeah.
But like I was curious, and I felt like these classes that I was taking from professors who were doing psychology in a more worlded way
Mm.
were giving me the theoretical and methodological tools that I needed to get traction on what was happening in my world. I mean, the other thing that was going on was when me and the people around me were having mental health struggles, it felt like the people that we were going to for help didn't really understand us. I was a goth. I was surrounded by other goths. We were very into our own suffering,
Yeah.
but there were also just things we did not talk about with each other, right? There was a lot of like secrets and like unexpressed desires and yearnings and longings. And so I went down to the college counseling center at one point. A whole bunch of us went down there to advocate for a friend of ours who had been hospitalized, and we wanted her to be able to return to campus. And the guy that we talked to said, well, I've been wanting to start a psychotherapy group, and I think you guys would make a great psychotherapy group. Do you want to do group therapy? And we were like, oh God, no. Like,
Oh my
what's
God.
wrong with you? But I just remember
Yeah.
thinking there was a little bit of a cultural divide there.
Right.
That there was something about the ways that we were seeking explanations for our suffering that were not being recognized and taken up by the people that we were talking to. Um, I thought that we could do better. I wanted to pursue a clinical psychology that would be a little bit more tuned into the cultural milieu of the people that we were working with. Um,
Mhm.
and so that became a real question for me, that I went on to pursue. So I graduated college, at kind of the last minute, was like, I want to be a psychologist. What do I do? So, poor Jean Marichek, who's been a wonderful mentor to me for my entire career. I was just emailing with her yesterday. Um, was like, okay, well, you need clinical experience, you need research experience. So I spent a bunch of years getting that, volunteering at a bunch of different labs, working at a halfway house for men with developmental disabilities and mental health issues. And working as an administrative coordinator in a psychiatry residency and actually a temp agency for moonlighting psychiatrists. So,
Mhm.
really getting to know a lot of people in a lot of different professional roles. At the time, it just felt totally desperate and haphazard. But looking back, I'm like, these were great jobs. I learned a ton. And it helped position me to look for a graduate program that was going to offer me what I was looking for, which turned out to be really hard to find. Um, I wound up going to an interdisciplinary department, the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago.
Mhm.
Um, and from there, and I can, talk about all of that time, but where I wound up was, fortunately at the time I was looking for a job, Duquesne was hiring, and was really excited to wind up somewhere that they were really thinking about the doing of psychology in an innovative way.
Mhm.
Um, and taking up a lot of the questions that had driven me through my whole career. So was very excited that the job was available, was very excited that they decided to interview me for the job, and then, was very happy to get the job and come here. And I've been here ever since. It's been a little over 10 years now.
Wow, that's amazing, Elizabeth. Like, I feel like it's so interesting to hear your story because it has like all these different elements, and curiosity seems the key to it all. Like
Hmm.
being curious about the world. Would you say that that is what it takes beyond experience in the systematical, research and clinical to be a human science therapist?
I would say that everybody's got to have something that drives them.
Okay.
Everybody's got to have something that drives you to say, I want to do psychology in a way that maybe isn't as common, right? I'm going to look a little harder for that place where the work is being done in a way that resonates with me. But I think just psychology in general, I mean, if you're going to go to grad school, or
Mhm.
clinical psychology, if you're going to work
Sorry.
with patients,
Yeah.
it's hard work. And, especially now where there's not as much support for graduate training, when graduate students are facing so many other pressures in their lives, it is scary to embark on this kind of long-term course of study when the world is changing so much. You don't know what things are going to be like on the other side of that, 6, 7 year thing. So I would say you've got to have something. For me, it's been curiosity.
Mhm.
For me, it's just been this like wanting to know, wanting to understand. Curiosity is a driver for me in all areas of my life, in a lot of my relationships. I'm often the one who's sort of asking people a lot of questions about what's going on for them. In my research,
Mhm.
I'm often just really motivated by just what it's like to interview somebody whose life experience has been different from mine. I find that very thrilling,
Mhm.
and very satisfying. So, I think you've got to have something that does that for you, that motivates you, that
Mhm.
thrills you, that satisfies you, that gives you a sense that maybe what you're doing is on the right track in one way or the other. But that's going to be different for different people, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, and from what you're saying about like, this kind of graduate training and how this way of doing psychology at times can be niche,
Mhm.
what kind of advice would you give to someone that may be in a graduate training or, thinking about going to grad school and are not in the environment that think about human science? Or how could you how could they still, learn from that
Mhm.
environment but still find a way to thrive and if human science is where they want to end up at or like the kind of psychology they want to do, like how to navigate those, divisions in the world.
Yeah. I mean, my number one piece of advice for that, I think, would be just talk to people. Um,
Mhm.
and again, I'm saying this as a curious person, I'm like, go on, websites of different programs and read people's biographies. But also, something that I realized the older I get and the further into this industry that I get, it's like people are not as intimidating as I thought they were. I've gotten to meet so many people that, like, when I first met them, I was like, oh my gosh, you're Rebecca Lester, right? Like, shout out to Rebecca Lester, who's, now kind of a pal of mine. We hang out at conferences. There are people, if there are people whose work you love that really speaks to you, it is okay to drop them an email and say, hey, your work really speaks to me, you know, or even your work really speaks to me. How might I do work like this myself? Um,
Mhm.
Go to conferences. Even if you are, an undergraduate or just post grad undergrad looking at grad school, even if you don't have like a paper to present yet, if there's any way you can, don't know if I should say this on camera, but sneak in or, find some way, volunteer.
That's a
That's
good one.
legit. Volunteer at conferences, find some way to get yourself into those conversations, sit down at a lunch table with people and get talking.
Mhm.
Of course, you're going to run into people who don't feel like talking or don't feel like talking to you or have somebody else they need to be talking to. Like that absolutely happens. But I think the majority of people, the majority of the time, are going to be eager to get to know somebody who's curious about what they're doing, who cares about what they're doing, who thinks they're on the right track.
Mhm.
That's it's always very exciting to me to hear from people who, you know, think what I'm doing is cool. And so getting into those conversations and really asking questions like, where did you go to school? Why did you go to school there? What did that program offer you?
Mhm.
Or where, what is your job now? What do you do in a day? What's a typical day for you?
Mhm.
What was this? What are you presenting at this conference? How did you come to this idea? How did you arrive at this particular topic? If you know a lot about somebody's work, how did you get from the project you were doing before to this project?
Mhm.
Asking just, yeah, questions. I mean, I'm also trained as an anthropologist. In a way, these are anthropological questions, but
Interesting.
getting into the habit of asking people about their life worlds can give you a sense of the lay of the land. And then you can use that map to navigate and chart your own course. So I'd say that would probably be my number one piece of advice.
Mhm. Yes, like that human connection and like reaching out.
Hmm.
It can be scary at times, especially when you read someone's work and you're like, oh my God. Like I had that in my
Hmm.
own life. I remember
Hmm.
coming to before being a grad student at Duquesne. We met because I was part of the fellowship
That's right. Hmm.
for underrepresented students in psychology. And, I spent so much time before even the fellowship was a thing,
Hmm.
reading about Duquesne's work. And I was like, I'm meeting Harry Styles of academia from here right now. This is the coolest
Yep.
thing ever. Like, how do I talk to you? Like,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
it was like a very vivid memory for me of those moments. But, you know, sometimes you're like, I had no idea like that you were this cool as a person when I read your work. Because, things get so complex in academia language at times
Hmm.
and like reading research. But I feel like, from I had the opportunity of doing the fellowship and learned how to find my way.
Hmm.
But I do feel like at times people are not lucky in the way that I was at the
Yeah.
time. But,
Yeah.
dropping an email and like reaching out really builds that kind of relationship for sure.
Yeah. And I'm glad you think I'm cool. I think of myself as being tremendously awkward, and I think a lot of academics probably do. So that, another piece of it is like when you do email somebody and you don't hear back, or when you do start a conversation with somebody and it feels cold or stilted or weird, to try to give some grace to yourself and give some grace to that other person.
Yeah.
Like they probably don't hate you, they're probably just pretty awkward.
No, and that's like the funniest part because I remember when we first got into Duquesne, our first orientation week, and I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. You came in and you're like, yeah, if you're here, you end up being a little bit weird. And I was like, wait, what? I thought I was cool 5 minutes ago, but weird is cool, awkward is also cool in our own ways.
Mhm.
And, I feel like people end up being like really cool in that individual, interest of theirs, even though it might not be like you are my, reflection in the mirror
Yeah.
at times. So
Yeah, exactly.
it is so interesting how when you're part of this world and you're looking into psychology and meeting all these people, at times you read their work. So you're saying how it is nice to like get an email that someone is interested, and you have like such an extensive work with like the furries. Like it would be
Mhm.
nice to talk about what are those, and especially with your work like as an anthropologist and
Mhm.
doing field work, where do you want to start? Like how can we talk about your research?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you've kind of really honed in on something important about my research, which is that there are these two kind of access points, right? We can talk about it through about topic, and then we can talk about it through method.
Sweet.
And those are the kind of two main areas of my work right now,
Mhm.
that I do a lot of work around the intersection of culture and cognition, particularly around the intersection of neurodevelopmental difference and culture and subculture. Um, so you mentioned that I do some work on autism with furries. And I can talk about what furries are, but so that's a kind of a creative community and subculture where there's a lot of neurodiversity in the fandom, in the furry fandom. And so it's been an interesting place for me to look at how our different kinds of minds create different kinds of spaces and then what those spaces offer to people who come in.
Mhm.
But the other thing I've been working on a lot over the past bunch of years, and I've done a lot of this work with Jonathan Yahalom, who's another graduate of the Duquesne program, who's now working at the VA in
Mhm.
Los Angeles. But is on ethnography for psychologists. So, having trained as in this interdisciplinary department in psychology, but also anthropology, I got exposed to more different kinds of methods than um, one often gets trained in. So, in a lot of psychology programs, you tend to work closely with one or two different professors and really learn their method, learn their technique, and then take that up and continue that. And in a sense, that was true for me as well. I had the real wonderful opportunity to work closely with Tanya Luhrmann, who is also an anthropologist and psychologist, or an anthropologist. She's sort of an anthropologist who's connected with psychology, as I'm a psychologist who's connected with anthropology. But anthropologists primarily do ethnographic research. So primarily, and anthropologists do all kinds of different things,
Yeah.
but ethnography has been associated with anthropology. And ethnography is really sort of the process of immersing yourself into a way of life in order to understand as much as possible about how that life is lived, um, and to get as close as we can to the experiences of people who are living that life in that world, knowing, and this is the sort of poignant thing about ethnography, the tension of it is that you will never be fully of that world. You will always be in it to a certain extent as an outsider, even if you are studying your own place, even if you are studying your own community, because most of us don't go through our lives primarily as observers. Most of us are like not doing the things we do just so that we can write about them,
Mhm.
or that we can do something academic or literary, the sort of graphia, the writing in ethnography. You know, there are a lot of people who sort of go through their lives to write books about it. There are memoirists, there are imaginative people. I'm someone who's always kind of writing a book in my head.
Yeah.
But there's a way in which ethnography is about participant observation, about doing both of those things, being part of a world, but also observing it closely.
Mhm.
Ethnographers tend to take a lot of notes about their surroundings. They will often do a lot of interviews, talk with people, ask a lot of questions, formally and also informally, right? We learn a lot from just the interactions that we have with people in a world. And then we do a lot of kind of collecting other materials as well. So, in my work with young adults on the autism spectrum and their creative lives, I've
Mhm.
wound up with a lot of comics. I've wound up with a lot of drawings. I've wound up with a lot of these sort of artifacts that people have created. And those have been really, really informative and inspirational for my work.
Mhm.
So, I believe that ethnography is a really, really important approach for psychologists who are trying to do this kind of psychology in the world, a psychology of how we create and then our creations shape us in turn. So I think ethnography is a really powerful technique, and a lot of the work that I've been doing is about how do you do an ethnography that is psychologically informed, that foreground psychological questions, questions about psychological processes. Um, and that's also informed by, for those of us who are clinicians and who have trained in things like diagnostic assessment or psychotherapy, or gone really deep into psychological theories like, let's say psychoanalytic theories, or theories from, say, internal family systems. How do you, or you mentioned gestalt therapy earlier, like how do you bring these theories to bear on your ethnographic observation and write-up? So that's, to me, that's what it means to be a clinical ethnographer, and that's how I identify myself.
Mm-hmm. All of this that you say makes a lot of sense to me, not just because of your clear speech and experience. But last semester, I had the opportunity to do a research practicum
Hmm.
with you, and we got a little bit of taste of what it means to be a clinical ethnographer
Hmm.
in the world.
It's really difficult, isn't
It
it?
is. And I had no clue because it sounds so smooth when you say it. It's like, yeah, you go there. No.
No.
Like when you're there, it's so much of being like, what are you even looking into? How are
Hmm.
you taking up those interactions that you're seeing? But
Hmm.
also, as much as you can be part of that community, you are not perceived as one of them. I remember people looking at my notes and like looking at me suspicious and
Hmm.
as if I'm disruptive of that space, even
Hmm.
though I had, complete clearance to do
Hmm.
what I was doing. But there is something about there's no outsider, but you have to come into a game that is not fully yours.
Yeah.
So also acknowledging that space
Hmm.
that you take up and what kind of theories are you looking into and how perspective really shapes the way that we understand this.
And
So,
I love that about your project last semester, that you came in with a really clear set of questions. And I think those questions were really effective in guiding your work.
mm,
And at the same time, there was all this new stuff that came up, right? And a lot of it had to do with how people were interpreting you,
mhm,
in this space that, was in some ways a space of intercultural encounter.
yes.
How were people taking up your presence in that space? What were they making of you?
Mhm. And that was, lived rent free in my head. You just come to, our meetings like, all of this happened last week. I don't know how to make sense of this.
Hmm.
And, you with all your knowledge and experience, you would just like tie it all together. It's like, yeah, that's what was happening.
Hmm.
So I feel like anthropologists really get that thing that, labs miss.
Hmm.
Like the natural environment, that kind of expression of self. And, those environments at times reminds me of the work you do with the furry community of
Hmm.
as a way of expression.
Hmm.
Would you mind talking more about it? Like how, experiences where, the furry con, like all
Hmm.
those conventions also kind of set up an environment, not like a lab, but it arises different things for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you raise a really good point here about sort of ethnography and its differences from lab science, and that in ethnography, a lot of the mess kind of is the work, right? You have these experiences where you're like, I don't even know what just happened. And then you get from that to a place where you're able to say, yes, this is what happened. Um, and to a certain extent, that's the work.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it is also really important to have some kind of structures in place that bound the work. You can't just go everywhere and look at everything and anything, And so for you, having, this one place that you went on a fairly regular basis and this one set of questions that you had to apply to that space was what allowed for a lot of that new stuff to emerge and to be sensible, right? To have some
Mhm,
kind of sense that you could make out of it.
mhm,
And so, that's part of what's exciting about working with furries is that they are a culture and a community that's always changing and always presenting me with new experiences, but that also is sort of very specific. So what
mhm,
is a furry? A furry is
mhm.
a someone who is a fan of anthropomorphic animals. So walking, talking, human animal hybrid creatures, kind of characters you might see on, like, I'm dating myself here, but Disney's Robin Hood, right, with the foxes.
Sure.
Or, for a more recent example, Zootopia, or a lot of kind of Disney films, a lot of cartoons, sports mascots, Tony the Tiger. These creatures are very, very prevalent in the culture. And they're especially prevalent in children's media. So a lot of us grow up looking at, listening to, paying attention to these kinds of figures. And for a lot of us, we kind of outgrow it. We're sort of like, all right, well, I'm an adult now and I'm not interested in that stuff. But for a lot of people, that interest continues. And so, for a lot of people, this kind of intense interest in this kind of media, in this kind of figure, continues to be a really important part of their imaginative aesthetic life, and a big part of their social life, because there are communities of people who kind of come together around this interest. And these communities have developed a really interesting set of practices about how to be with each other. So, for example, a lot of furries have this thing called a fursona, which is a version of yourself as a walking, talking human animal hybrid creature.
Mm-hmm.
And very often the fursona, it's kind of like an idealized version of yourself. So if you're someone who's always been a little shy, a little awkward, a little uncertain of themselves socially, your fursona can be somebody who is maybe more outgoing, more willing to try things like dancing at a dance party or singing at karaoke. Furries do a lot of karaoke. This is one of the things I love about furries. I also do a lot of karaoke.
You're a singer, so
It's true. It's true. And again, sort of coming back to like being a goth and what it was like for me to kind of, the first band that I was in, it really liberated me to be able to like put on a wig, put on an outfit and really play this role. And I could do things with my voice in that setting that I didn't feel like I could do when I was like a folk singer with an acoustic guitar and I was supposed to just sort of be my authentic self, right? Like tell my story about me and my feelings. And like, I liked having that level of artifice. It was really liberating. And I think the same thing is often true for furries and the fursona is that you have this opportunity to play with a different way of being.
Right.
And in doing that, you can actually kind of cultivate some capacities that might otherwise be difficult to cultivate in your daily life. And this is why, as somebody who looks at autism and looks at neurodevelopmental difference, I'm really impressed with what the furries have come up with here, because it turns out that there are a lot of people on the autism spectrum in the furry fandom. Not a majority. It's something like 5 to 15%, according to my research team's, survey research. So, it's a goodly number, and bigger than the overall population prevalence, right?
Mhm.
So this means that the furries are doing a good job of, encouraging our participation, inclusion, by people who often have difficulty with this, right? Especially young adults on the spectrum often have a hard time finding community, finding that kind of social capital, building social networks. So
Mhm.
this is a much more positive story, in a lot of ways than you often hear in autism research. So I was very intrigued by it for that reason, right? What are the furries doing right? What can we learn from them? And I think looking closely at practices like fursona creation and fursona play, can actually kind of open up some new ways of thinking about the self, how we learn to be ourselves, and what we kind of imagine that it's possible for us to be.
Mhm. 100%. And as you are there, and as autism, there's one of the psychological things we study is masking. It's like
Hmm.
how they learn how to socialize with others. Do
Hmm.
you feel like when they are in this like fursona, is that the term you use?
Fursona, it's like a
Fursona.
persona, but fur.
Yeah. So when they're in the fursona, do you think that allows them to think of different possibilities for themselves, or that's not quite what it is?
Yeah, I mean, this question's come up a lot for our research team, thinking about like what to do with the literature on masking, right? Because a lot of times people on the autism spectrum actually experience masking as being really oppressive and difficult, right? It's exhausting, it's hard, um, it's tedious, it takes energy away from other things. So, the need to mask is often experienced and depicted as being sort of unhelpful in a lot of ways, necessary in a lot of circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
but also sort of debilitating. But people actually, seek out opportunities to experiment with new ways of being,
Mm-hmm.
when they are in spaces where that can be done creatively, where there's a lot of room to experiment with different kinds of self-expression, and where the stakes are not so high. So if you are at a job interview and you have to look like somebody who has good social skills or good soft skills, or good oral communication skills,
Mm-hmm.
that's very stressful. You're having to meet a set of expectations that you don't really know what they are. They're pretty vague. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there's a sense that sort of everybody else knows what these are, what they're supposed to look like, but very few people actually experience themselves as knowing what actually these are supposed to look like. So there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's this sense that, this is sometimes referred to as like the hidden curriculum or the hidden rule book,
Mm-hmm.
in autism communities, that like there's this sense that, yeah, there's a set of rules out there that everybody's supposed to know, but like somehow the individual person doesn't know. You're supposed to live up to these expectations that are invisible, that are never conveyed to you clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But this is actually the fun thing about a lot of these subcultural communities. Like, I think about this with role playing games, like live action role playing games. The fun thing about that is that, like, the rule book is not invisible, right? Everybody has the same kind of set of, you know, everybody knows that the people of the river and the people of the ocean have been at war for 400 years. And,
Yeah.
if you are a sea creature, you have these characteristics. And if you are a sky creature, you have these, it's
Mm-hmm.
made explicit. It's
Right.
articulated clearly and it's shared.
Mm-hmm.
So, coming back to this question of how is a persona different or similar than masking, I think that there is a kind of an articulated set of kind of shared materials. Most personas look kind of cartoony. A lot of them don't, but there is a kind of a shared symbolic repertoire that is getting drawn from in the creation of the persona. You can go to panels about like, how do I make my persona? Or how do I develop a character? How do I build these skills in my character? There's a lot of, teaching and learning that takes place around it, but there's also a lot of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of freedom to make your persona whatever color, pick whatever personality traits, whatever kind of interests, whatever name, whatever species, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or combination of species. There's a lot of flexibility there within the kind of existing symbolic grammar. And I think that people find that very energizing. I think that it feeds rather than depletes. And those are some of the differences that I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it also does help people approach the masking process in a different way. That once you're no longer dealing with this expectation of like, my outside has to look like my inside, it's supposed to reflect my inside, but actually that there's some room for play there,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some room for experimentation, and there's some room for practice, before you necessarily feel like you have it
Mm-hmm.
down. You can practice
Yeah.
being confident without feeling confident.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that it can help make the, masking that is always necessary in this life feel a little bit less like this awful thing that's being imposed on people, and a little bit more like something that one can, you know, play with a little bit more deliberately. I
For
hope, at
sure.
least.
Mm-hmm. From what you're saying, the stakes are not as high as a job interview and allows the furry culture allows the space for a narrative of distress and being able to learn maybe in a way how
Yeah.
to deal with those things.
Yeah.
And with social media these days,
Mhm.
like this is really out there about like what is autism,
Mhm.
where it comes from. Even a lot of public figures have a saying on it. Some truthful, some not so much based on science. So how
Topical.
yeah.
This is
So
being recorded on September 24th, 2025,
yes.
for what it's worth.
Yeah, just for context. So, how would you take up those challenges maybe, and how social media perceives autism and people that are users of this communication channel even put maybe themselves into
Mhm.
question, like, do I have autism, because that's like the word that
Mhm.
we see online. So, or even, yeah, like, you were diagnosed with autism. Is that the whole of you? Is it not? Like, would you mind talking? I think all of the things I said is like pretty broad, but narrowing it down would say, like, what is even autism? Like, perhaps if you,
Oh, that's not very broad.
yeah, that's a more direct, but, maybe trying to address a little bit where it comes from, or like, if there's a place at all, and how to like best talk with people who read about the news
Mhm.
or read about public figures talking about it, how to navigate having a diagnosis, or even thinking, oh, I'm probably, or I think I am part of this community.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think both the sort of form and content of your question have touched on a lot of important things that like autism has become this massive category
Yeah.
and it has become a category that is very meaningful for a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And this has been, something that I have been looking at all the way back to like my master's thesis in grad school, watching things change and then recently also feeling a little bit of like, oh, but the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? We're still grappling with a lot of the same questions about what autism is, what it means, how to respond to it.
Mhm.
But at the same time, with social media making so many perspectives and so much information available to people, there is a kind of a proliferation of different ways of thinking about autism.
Mhm.
And and what is accessible is not just the information, but also the capacity to contribute to it, right?
Mhm.
So I've become really interested in like memes and meme culture and the way that that is shifting people's explanatory models for their distress. So, you are experiencing something that you don't understand. Like a lot of the people that the young adults that I interviewed for my master's thesis back in like 2005, who were just beginning to kind of come to this identification with autism, were saying things like, I just never understood why, you know, people didn't interpret me in the way I intended, why I didn't interpret people in the way they intended, how everybody else seemed to be able to understand what was happening and I didn't, all of these mysteries that autism kind of came to be a good explanation for. And the
Mhm.
coexistence of things too, oh, my problems reading facial expressions might also be connected to the ways that I hate tags on my shirts, or the fact that I, don't feel safe eating certain foods because they feel like they're hard on my body in certain ways that I can't quite put my finger on how to express, So there's all this stuff that kind of goes together and that autism has started to be a term for explaining or making sense of. Um, and at the same time, it's become such a broad term that it is hard to really say what it means or what it is, right? I mean, to a certain extent, I would say that autism is a certain set of innate tendencies or characteristics
Mhm.
that we tend to develop either from birth or very early on in life.
Mhm.
And that they tend to manifest in, often difficulty navigating a social world,
Mhm.
often reliance on structure and consistency, or patterns, existing patterns in order to shape one's experience of the world. And often this comes along with something having to do with engagement in sensory environments. Sometimes that can be an experience of sort of sensory chaos or overwhelm.
Mhm.
Sometimes it has to do with seeking out certain kinds of sensory input. There's a lot of capacities for pleasure that come along with it. And sometimes it has to do with, strong dislike of particular kinds of sensory input or sensory avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
But, a way of doing sensation that feels like it is often at a kind of a misfitting angle
Mm-hmm.
with the demands of, our very weird sensory environment that we're in. I mean,
Right.
we are existing in an environment that is very different from the environment that we evolved for, because so much of it is of human creation. So
Mm-hmm.
much of it is built. And so, you know, I think roughly, broadly, autism is a term that encompasses those things, but autism is also, for a long time associated with comorbid intellectual disability. And so sort of what role that plays in the story of autism is a really contested one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also, often associated with a lot of difficulties making one's way in the world, in a way that, is very difficult for individuals who are affected, is also often very difficult for the parents who are raising them, to think about what is going to become of my child when I'm not around. Who is going to provide the help and guidance that maybe I have been providing. And so, those features that are not always a part of autism, but often are and historically have been very definitive of it, before we really started tuning into a lot of the more subtle, maybe manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think all of those things are sort of on the table when we're talking about autism. Language is another one. A lot of people on the autism spectrum use spoken language to communicate and to make sense of the world. A lot of people on the autism spectrum do not. For a lot of people, there are other modalities that are a lot more primary, a lot more essential.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are all like differences and distinctions that are at stake in autism, but it is really hard to kind of stick a pin in it and say, oh, this is what it is,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it hard to do things like research autism or research interventions. And then that question of should we even be trying to research interventions for autism writ large, or does it make more sense to be looking at interventions for the particular disabilities or difficulties that people living under this description tend to face?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for bringing up like the phenomenon and how that's also a very individualized process for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people and so unique at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I think, every let's say mental disorder in a way like has like facts and myths, but
Mm-hmm.
autism tends to be, in my opinion, the more most prevalent one throughout decades about like what causes autism. Is
Mm-hmm.
this this or that? And like,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of myths at times, and you talking about this, it's important to educate people and audience, and because it's hard
Mm-hmm.
to know what to believe in, especially
Mm-hmm.
if you're not in the field. And
Yeah.
sometimes people that you trust have this idea, which was a common belief for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really important. Thank you for addressing this
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, there's a lot of mysteries around autism, and there's a lot of like, when people are confronted with something that is unexpected or surprising or they don't understand,
Mm-hmm.
they look for an explanation. This is again thinking about psychology as a human science. This is a very human thing,
Mm-hmm.
that we look for explanations in our world. When we look for explanations, we look for patterns. And something that science can sometimes help us with is to do that bigger and better and in a more kind of structured or systematic way than we can do as individuals or even as kind of groups of people who might share an interest.
Mm-hmm.
But what's been frustrating about the science for autism is that it hasn't been able to point to a single cause. And I think people are very, very hungry for that, very much like yearning for that. But that is not something that science has been able to unearth. And there may not be an answer for that question. There, very well may not be any kind of single cause.
Mm-hmm.
And that is hard for people, and I get that.
But from all of this, cause and effect is usually how we tend to work in like the human mind. But at times there's so much about the intricacies of like that lived world that at times is still something that science is working on.
Yes.
And what is something you would like to tell the audience that may see on social media or from other people, or a quick Google search of like what is autism, what are the symptoms, and may find themselves in distress at times, wondering um who they are and how that is also part of their lives in a way, and or even living with the question, like, is that even part of my life? Like, what would you say to this audience?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to people who are questioning whether autism might be a good descriptor for them, might help them make sense of some of the things that they've experienced in their life. For me, I tend to steer away from the question of, am I autistic? Yes or no? For people who are wondering about this. And that might sound strange as somebody who is a diagnostician, as a clinical psychologist. Like I do try to give people diagnoses, put people in diagnostic categories. I think that
Yeah.
they're often very helpful as a heuristic. Um, but autism, because of the way that the category is structured and because of the way that it's been kind of taken up, and how many different kinds of knowledge production have been brought to bear on it, I don't know if it really functions that way. You're in or you're out. You can meet this set of criteria or not meet that set of criteria. You can have a formal diagnosis or not have a formal diagnosis. You can have a diagnosis from excuse me, like a therapist or clinician. You cannot have a diagnosis from a therapist or clinician. There's all these different ways of talking about, what it means to have a diagnosis or not. But if you're really just thinking about yourself and your own experience, I guess my advice would be to take advantage of the really rich array of resources out there for thinking about experience. So, read the scientific literature on autism from a variety of different disciplinary perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Read the literature in psychology and journals that are about autism. Read the literature in anthropology. There's a lot of really interesting work on autism and anthropology. But
Mm-hmm.
also read the autobiographies of people on the autism spectrum. My go-to book in this genre is Dawn Prince Hughes's Songs of the Gorilla Nation, My Journey Through Autism. I think she is such an incredible writer. I mean, it's just one of my favorite books, period. It's such a gorgeous, enjoyable read. And part of that is because she really gets into, she's got this remarkable memory and she can really get into what it was like for her to be a little girl running around the house saying the same word over and over and over and over again, why she did that, why it felt so good to her, what it was like for her to go to elementary school and just feel broken by how overwhelming the experience was. She really puts you in the shoes of that person who is discovering the world without even the word autism, which she didn't come to until, as the case was for many people, until she was in her mid 30s and a younger relative of hers was getting diagnosed. And she suddenly went, oh, family. She calls them ancestral hymns, these family lineages.
Mm-hmm.
So, reading books by people on the spectrum about their experience, or other kinds of media. There's tons of stuff out there now.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of looking at what is resonant for you and then following those paths, right? So maybe you're a person for whom your struggles with sensory input are primary. Maybe you are a person for whom your problems forming social relationships are primary.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you are a person for whom your having become very good at forming social relationships, but it being extremely effortful at all times is
Right.
primary. What is your story and how does it relate to other people's stories? I that would be kind of my go-to. And talk to other people who know, talk to a therapist or a mental health provider or a variety of therapists and mental health providers.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to autistic people you know. If you don't know any autistic people or don't know they're autistic, try to make some friends who are. Go into spaces, where autism is welcomed and held, and supported, maybe even celebrated.
Mm-hmm.
And try to get to know some people that way. Those are some ways to, I think, kind of inform your own conception of what the word means to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love how you touch based on like how even different practitioners take upon autism differently. So one practitioner may say one thing where another one may not. And this is when human science becomes so crucial into, okay, this diagnosis might be on the table for me. Sure. But how does that show up in my life?
Yeah.
How can I deal with it? What meaning do I address to this diagnosis? And how can I, live with and like make sense of this, without just defining your whole thing, your whole identity on it. Perhaps it's a part of you, but it becomes also very subjective if it is the part of the whole. That's up to the person, and human science will also look into that. But how there's a lot more to a person, and who they are, alongside with a diagnosis. So
Yeah. I mean, one of the beautiful and terrible things of living in the very individualized world that we live in is that there is a way in which we all get to sort of tell our own story, And so, something that was sort of coming into my mind as you were talking is like, I want to say to people, don't let anyone tell you you're broken, because a lot of times I do, talk to people for whom autism is this way of kind of thinking about all the things that are wrong with them. And, the fact that they're stuck that way. These things are always going to be wrong with them and they're always going to have this problem because there's no cure for autism. But I also would say, don't let anyone tell you you're not. That like, because I've also talked to people who have had experiences of feeling like, wow, I have this difference that makes life really hard for me. And they've done wonderful creative work around finding narratives of, what does it mean to be somebody who is carrying this thing that is very difficult to carry. And, I think sometimes the ways that we try to be positive and supportive and celebratory about autism can understate some of the difficulties and struggles and pain that people face that are very real. So, I think, building the story that makes sense for you from the range of different resources that are available and trying to tune into multiple different kinds of stories when you do that, I think is important as well.
and powerful.
Yeah.
Like a lot of empowerment comes from that, from knowing your own story, seeing how that affects you and how you take up on that in a very unique way. I think is the key to like navigating life and being comfortable in your own skin, even within the challenges that may appear.
Yeah. And in a way, that kind of comes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about human science psychology. That a lot of it is about listening to people's stories, listening to a variety of different stories, holding space for the immensity of suffering and the possibilities for growth and enjoyment and creativity and pleasure, and meaning that exist within our human situation, and trying to find ways to integrate them and bring them together, even when it's incredibly challenging to do that, even when it's very difficult, and even sometimes when it feels like the world isn't reflecting that process back to you.
For sure. Thank you so much on all your thoughts and taking up on those questions, Elizabeth. I appreciate you. And before we wrap this up, I have a question for you. So,
Okay.
are you down to play a game?
Always.
Okay. So, there is this one question that I would love to know. What is your thoughts on? I separated
Oh, this is a
it
card
before.
game.
It is a card game. Here it is. So, it is kind of like this or that. So,
Okay.
you can just choose or give me your thoughts on it.
Okay. You're going to play the
So-
game of this or that.
Yes. So here it says, opening a box full of spiders or opening a box full of snakes.
Would I rather open a box full of spiders or open a box full of snakes? That is a tough one because I really like them both.
Yeah, we all talked about
Yeah.
spiders, but what about snakes? Like, how would you choose that?
Man, I would have to say snakes. I like spiders, but I really like snakes. And recently, just the other day, I was in a bad mood, and I texted a friend of mine that I was in a bad mood, and he texted me back a picture from a tattoo parlor that has a whole wall full of snakes, and I love this wall at this tattoo parlor. He actually texted me the lizard, but he knew it would cheer me up, and I did. Oh yeah, I remember all those snakes. They're great. I love snakes. So yeah, a box full of snakes would be really. Do you have one?
No.
Oh well.
Elizabeth, I will leave the snakes and the spider all up to you.
Okay.
Not my thing, not into it. I'm very scared of them.
Okay.
So props to you. So if I ever encounter a box of snakes, I'll text you. Like, you're
You
the
got
one
it.
for the rescue. So
Excellent. I will come over and I will open it with pleasure.
thank you so, so much. And thank you for watching. I will see you in the next episode. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.